Hey guys, today what we're doing is we're looking at ratios and how we can solve them using something called ratio tables. So the first thing I want to talk about is, let's say you're making cookies. So if you're working with a recipe and you have your recipe, your amount of butter and your flour and so on and so forth, right? And a lot of times though, when you make something, we want to make like a double batch, right? I want to make twice as many cookies. So if this was the case, instead of 1 cup of butter, I would add 2 cups of butter, right? Instead of 1 cup of sugar, it would be 2 cups of sugar, so on and so forth. So I would double every value. Or similarly, sometimes if you have a really large recipe, sometimes we want to make half or 3/4 of a recipe, so you adjust every value based on that amount. And what we're looking at with this is something that's called a ratio or an equivalent ratio. And that's our big idea here today, is that we're going to be taking numbers and basically we're comparing them, and that's called a ratio. And how we can do that is a technique used a ratio, or a technique called using a ratio table. And we'll look at that in a second. But first of all, let's back up one more time and let's talk about specifically what is a ratio. Well, we saw an example of, changing our ratio of butter to flour, when we double or half a recipe, something like that. So a ratio is just simply a comparison of two quantities, all right? 2 to 3, right? Comparing 2 to 3, that's an example of a ratio, right? And those can all be written 3 different ways. So we have, we can say A to B, right? So as we'd read it, like, again, 2 to 3. I could write it as a fraction, as like 2 over 3, or I can do it with a colon in between, so a ratio of 2 to 3. So all of these mean ratios, all of these are really technically interchangeable, just different ways that we can write, how we're comparing one thing to another. So let's look at a couple examples, all right? So we have a recipe here that uses 2 cups of flour for every 1 cup of water, okay? So what is the ratio? All right, so the ratio is just as simple as we have 2 cups of flour for every 1 cup of water, right? So I could write it as a fraction. I can write it as 2 to 1, so my ratio of flour to water is 2 to 1, or I could write it with that colon. Okay. Now the advantage of a ratio again is that it's easy to modify. So if I have something like, all right, I want to change from 2 to 4 cups of flour, what would I do? And that's where I like to use my fraction, and we're going to see that in our fraction or our ratio tables in a second, right? But if I'm going to change a 2 to a 4, what would I need to do? Right? How am I going to make this fraction change? And we know that, well, 2 times 2 would give me the 4 that I'm looking for. And if I multiply something by one side of a fraction, I have to do that to the other, right? So this is just an equivalent ratio, right? I need 4 cups of flour to 2 cups of water. So how much water would I need for 4 cups of flour? 2 cups of water, all right? Now, one way we can use this when we start getting with some more difficult values is we can use what's called a ratio table. All right, so we can look at different ratios as we go to try and come up with, well, the equivalent ratios. So, all right, here we have a couple things. We're comparing cups to quarts. And what we need to look for is, all right, here we have an ordered pair. So we know that our ratio is 3 cups to 3/4 quarts. So maybe we're pickling something or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so that's our ratio that we go off of. And now what we can do is we're going to use this to fill in our tables. And there's multiple ways to go through this. All right, but one way I would do this is, let's maybe look at these first two here. So here I'm going from 3 cups to 12 cups. And you could ask yourself, all right, what do I need to do to go from 3 cups to 12 cups? Well, I could multiply by 4. All right, so if I multiply 3 by 4 to get 12, I can do that same step with 3/4. All right, so if I take 3/4 times 4, or 4 over 1, my 4's would cancel. I end up with 3. Okay, so 12 cups to 3/4 would be an example of an equivalent ratio. All right, so we got that value filled in. Now, let's look at the next one. All right, this one here is asking us to find 15. All right, so how can I do that? Well, I could go back and compare it to either one of the values that I have here. And hey, I recognize with my 3, if I multiply 3 by 5, I would get 15. So I can take 3/4 times 5 as well, or 5 over 1, okay? And that would give me 15/4. So 15/4 would give me what I need here. All right? So again, we're just trying to work our way through these tables to fill in these missing pieces. Okay? Oops, and I deleted a little too much there. But we said this was 15/4. All right. So now the last one. All right, we have 5/4 on the bottom. So again, we want to kind of work our way through this. But here's maybe what I could recognize, right? Is at this point, if I compare my last two pieces here, 15/4 and 5/4. All right. The change here is that 5 is a third of 15, right? So if I multiply 15/4 times a third, which would be the same as dividing by 3, I get 5/4. So I could do the same thing here, right? I could multiply by 1/3. So 15 times 1/3 would give me 5. So 5 would be my number I would put here. All right, I have one more for you to try here, so why don't you go ahead and pause your video and see if you can come up with these on your own. All right, so here's what I came up with for mine. On the bottom one here, all right, to do our first one in our box, we're going from 4 to 16. I recognize 4 times 4 is 16, so I took the 5/2 from the top, and multiplied that by 4, and got 10. So that's what I put in my box here. All right. Now I use that value to find the last piece of my table. I recognize to go from 10 to 5, I would multiply by 1/2, right? Because 10 times 1/2 is 5. So then if I do that with my bottom number, 16 times 1/2, I get 8, which gave me my final video here.